Do Christians belong in the public square? Should we check our faith at the door of political discourse? Why do these questions matter in a free society? Join us today as we talk about statecraft as soulcraft with our special guest, Dr. Francis Beckwith, professor of philosophy and church-state studies at Baylor University and author of the book, Politics for Christians. I'm Michael Hernon, Vice President of Advancement at Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio, and you're watching Franciscan University Presents. Stay with us. Welcome to Franciscan University Presents. Today we're talking about Christians and politics. I'm your host, Michael Hernon, Vice President of Advancement here at Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio, joined by our regular panelists, Dr. Regis Martin, Professor of Systematic Theology here at Franciscan University, Dr. Scott Hahn, the Father Michael Scanlon Professor in Biblical Theology and the New Evangelization here at Franciscan University, and our special guest, Dr. Francis Beckwith. You are both a professor of philosophy and church-state studies at Baylor, where you also serve as the Associate Director of Graduate Program in Philosophy and the Co-Director of Philosophy Studies and Religion at Baylor's Institute for Study on Religion. You have a PhD and an MA in Philosophy from Fordham. You also hold a Master's in Juridical Studies from Washington University School of Law. You're author of more than a dozen books. You also were the president of the Evangelical Theological Society before returning to the Catholic Church. And you and your wife, Frankie, are in Waco, Texas.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's
so
right.
It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here.
Yeah.
It's a delight.
Yeah, so in your book, you kind of begin, the great book, Politics for Christians. You begin with the notion that Christians aren't just called to be involved in politics, but really study politics, become students of politics. Why is this important?
Well, one of the problems today is that when we think of politics, we usually think of electoral politics.
Right.
That is, people running for office, campaigning for people, voting. One of the things I want to communicate in the book is that's not the entirety of politics. What I want to do is sort of reach back into a more ancient understanding of politics. That is, it has to do with life in the city or the polis.
Okay.
And so when I talk about being involved with politics and being aware of politics, I'm not just talking about electoral politics. It also involves understanding one's place in one's community. It involves the role of the church in helping the community in a variety of different ways. It means studying politics. That is the differences between, let's say, international relations and constitutional law. What does it mean to be a citizen? What kind of obligations do we have? And just like when we talk about the church having many parts, in different ways, citizens have different roles. And so, some people may want to run for office. Some people may want to volunteer at the soup kitchen. Some people may want to write letters to the editor. So there's a variety of things that a person can do within the structure of a political regime.
Yeah. I want to comment on that because I think that shift, it might seem, small, subtle, but it's significant. Yeah. It's sort of like a switch on a railroad. It's just a few inches, but you're going to end up in, San Diego or Bangor, Maine. When you identify it that way, politics, you tap into the notion of Aristotle that man is not only a rational animal but a political animal. But that doesn't mean you're either a Democrat or a Republican.
That's right.
It means that you're a member of a community, and that the polis, which is the root of the political, has to do more with a kind of extended family. At least that's the ideal that you strive for in community relations. And this has to do with education. It has to do with charitable works as well as the church, as you say. And that little shift that seems so small ends up being massive, and especially in our day and age, because everything is reductionistic. Everything is, are you Democrat, are you Republican? Do you watch CNN or Fox?
Yes.
And that sort of thing.
It's not a simple point at all, unless you want to endorse a kind of schizophrenic view of the human person. We really do belong in two worlds, and we have to somehow shape our lives in a fashion that is integrated and harmonious. I mean, the ancient distinction is that I'm in the world, but I'm not supposed to be of the world. I mustn't be enamored of the spirit of the age, because this is no lasting city. I'm called to transcend time and space. Clement, in his first letter, Pope St. Clement to the church at Corinth, begins by acknowledging we are a church in exile. And of course, they're under the burden, the pressure of constant persecution. But implicit in all of that is the admission that we're in the world, that we're not disincarnate spirits.
That's right.
We're embodied spirits. And so the world has to make provision for us, and we have to somehow fit the world into our perspective. That means politics.
That's right. I mean, if you think about just what we're told to do by Christ, to love our neighbor as ourselves.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
It means to will the good of the other. And depending on one's cultural and political circumstances, that could mean a variety of different things. So, for example, I've used this in class at Baylor. Say, you'll often hear citizens who let's say want to influence, let's say, a policy on a school board, and someone will say, well, that you shouldn't in any way, as a Christian, shape policy, or you shouldn't be suggesting these particular points of view because you're sort of forcing your views on others. But what's often ignored, or the response is something like, well, the government is not forcing you to do it. So I'll give you a more concrete example. Years ago, I remember watching an episode of the old Phil Donahue show. I don't know if you guys remember that. And there was a dentist who had complained about the show, and apparently wrote advertisers who wound up pulling their ads from the show. And so Donahue brought his show to San Antonio, where the dentist lived, to have a whole week of episodes. The dentist was invited, didn't show up, but there were people there who agreed with the dentist and some who disagreed. So during the question and answer section where Donahue would walk out with his microphone, he went to the first person who had raised her hand, and she said, well, the dentist doesn't have to watch the show if he doesn't want to. And it was great. There was a Catholic bishop on stage who immediately responded. He said, but the dentist isn't just concerned about him and his children. He's concerned that his children may grow up to date the children whose parents are not forbidding them from watching the show. And I just thought that was a great insight into the idea that we live, that there's a kind of moral ecology.
Right.
And that what we may be interested in is not so much, I mean, even if you take a kind of narrow view that we should just be concerned about ourselves and our own sort of development as Christians, even if that's all you're concerned about, that means that you should be concerned about your neighbor, because that does affect the way in which your children
It's a kind of evangelical impulse, I think. I mean, this dentist is not interested only in filling the cavities of his kids. He wants to somehow spread out and expand his art, and he's willing to do root canals even on Phil Donahue.
And really, when we look at politics, that's what we're talking about here. It's more than just about my own personal concerns, but it's about the body politic, the larger community that we have. So as we look forward, kind of giving us a politics 101, if you will, looking really more not as an activist in politics, but the understanding of more political science. When we look and hear the term liberal democracy, now, why is that a term that might be more favored today, or why would a Christian be more interested in that form of approach to politics?
Sure, let's define a liberal democracy, because oftentimes when people hear the word democracy, they tend to think of it as kind of voting on everything, kind of majority rules. And but my understanding of liberal democracy, and the one that I present in my book, Politics for Christians, is democracy is linked to the idea that citizens should be treated with equal dignity and respect, and that democracy, that is to say representative democracy, is a component of that, but can't, at the end of the day, be the only component for a variety of reasons. One, if you have a kind of system of government where everything gets voted on, what'll happen is you can have a tyranny of a majority. And this is why the American founders only have one component, at least initially, in the House of Representatives, being the component of directed elected officials, a Senate that was one step removed from the electorate, and then an executive branch and a judiciary that were even more further away from direct election. And the idea behind it was that that human beings cannot be trusted with absolute power. And so even though
unless they're federal judges.
That's right. Well, it's interesting you bring that up, Scott. I mean, we have changed clearly, and the changes have been, I think, in ways that are
judicial tyranny.
That's right, and especially on issues of great controversy over which reasonable citizens disagree, and that's why
if majorities vote for a definition of marriage,
that's right,
that can be overturned in a day.
But the defect that you've seized upon that can invalidate democracy applies also to every other system, every other competing creed, aristocracy, monarchy. Nobody can be trusted. That was Lord Acton's point.
That's right.
Power tends to corrupt, but absolute power corrupts absolutely.
That's right. And so, part of it, and it's something I think that we just haven't really appreciated, because things have generally gone very well in the United States since its founding, of course, except the Civil War. But generally, because there's been a culture, that is to say, people obey the law because they're sort of enculturated to believing that that's the way in which we should conduct ourselves. But I raise this question to my students. I say, there's only one president and 535 members of Congress. If they disagree with them, why can't they just walk down Pennsylvania Avenue and just say we're in charge, there's more of us, right? Well, the reason is that they've been enculturated into this understanding that the separation of powers is important for the common good, for civil society, and we sort of take this for granted, and we don't appreciate the fact that there are governments in the world that have been put together to emulate ours where it doesn't succeed. Why? Because there's not a civil society, which is not the government.
That's right.
A couple things. Number one, I think the point that we made a few minutes ago is crucial, that we are in exile. Clement said it so well back in the first century. Another point that we have to emphasize, and that is, we're not just isolated individuals, we form a social body. Paul speaks of the church as the body of Christ supernaturally, but long before Paul, the Stoics spoke of society as being a body politic. And so we're interrelated, like that bishop said on the Phil Donahue show. I think we also have to recognize the good of democracy, but not absolutize something that is only a relative good, because it isn't as though Thomas Aquinas or Bellarmine, who advocated monarchy or aristocracy along with democracy in a mixed order, were Pelagians who thought that power was safe in the hands of monarchs. No, the fact is, this Augustinian notion that humans are weak and sinful, permeates those who recognize that the family writ large is precisely what a monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy enshrines. And so I think it's time for Catholics to get involved in the political order, such as it is, but at the same time to stop preventing themselves from longing for something better and more Christian and more Catholic. Because I think deep down, most Catholics are in exile but don't know it. They're part of a body but don't think that way. And they're not in a Catholic order, but they don't even want to be. Well, it's so bad in the past. Well, sanctifying my soul is hard enough. Sanctifying the temporal order is not going to be any easier, but I'm not going to stop doing that because it's hard any more than I'm going to stop trying to sanctify my own soul and body because of the degree of difficulty.
It could be that it's sort of a distraction to focus only on the inherent deficiencies of democracy and say, look, we've got to get rid of it. We need to usher in something more genuinely Catholic. The fact is, we have democracy. We're stuck with it. So maybe we should flood the voting polls with Catholics so that 50% plus one can sort of shape the ethos that governs our lives. That might be a solution.
That's right.
I do think that democracy in some ways is a kind of sleight of hand, because it isn't an accident that federal judges have just usurped the kind of will of the majority. I think democracy is a rhetorical veil that covers up the degree of corrupt aristocracy and even more corrupt monarchy which has become tyrannical.
Yeah, and so we've got a lot to unpack with this. I
You
can
know
see,
that.
and so as we go to the next segment, I want to talk a little bit more about the relationship of the church and the state, and even the notion of the separation of church and state. Stay with us on Franciscan University Presents.
For me as a Christian in the world today, it is the most important thing to go into the world knowing that my Christian values are at the foundation. And I believe that that's absolutely necessary for anyone in the world today. For the political sphere, for me personally as a journalist, I believe that the Christian faith should be the foundation of everything that we do. Because the world kind of looks down on us today as being biased if we're Christian. I know that journalists tell you that you should be a journalist first and a Christian second, but in reality, I need my Christianity to be at the foundation because I need it to be a set of ethics that determines and defines everything that I do.
People recognize Franciscan University as being academically excellent and passionately Catholic. We have the unique opportunity through our faculty members, through our students, to proclaim that academic excellence by reaching out in many different ways. We also remain passionately Catholic in the way in which we are able to worship, the way in which we are able to bring that love of Christ to others on a daily basis. It's important for us to be able to embrace both.
Welcome back to Franciscan University Presents. We're talking about Christians and politics with our special guest, Dr. Francis Beckwith. Frank, we've been talking about politics and how it's bigger than simply just voting, although that's very much a part of it, but a bigger subject matter here. But as we look at Christians, I think one of the things that we often come to is the idea of church and state. Mm-hmm. And at least in America, this notion of the separation of church and state. What does that mean, and what is the impact really for Christians in that?
It's a great question, and one that has several different possible answers. If you go back in American history, it actually goes before Roger Williams actually coined the phrase or used the metaphor of the wall of separation of church and state, picked up by Thomas Jefferson in a famous letter that he wrote to the Danbury Baptists. What had happened, the Danbury Baptists were in Connecticut, and they lived in a state that had an established church. A lot of folks are sort of surprised because they didn't know that, most folks don't know that the early colonies and some of the early states had established churches, which just meant that the tax dollars on the assessment on property was used to support the established church. You could still believe in anything you want,
but
right?
The money was
But the
fun.
money. So to my students at Baylor, I explained, because they said they find that to be odd. He goes, well, how can you have religious liberty at the same time an assessment on tax? And I said, well, let me give you an analogy. The public school system. Right now, you're free to send your child to a private religious school, and yet the state will still tax your property to fund the public schools. I said, you tolerate it today. Yeah. And they sort of are shocked. They go, wow, never thought of it that way
That
before.
only began in the 1800s.
That's right.
I mean, that was unthinkable in the 1700s.
That's right. So what happened is that the Danbury Baptists write this letter they write a letter to Jefferson asking sort of for their support. As President of the United States, he has no power to change Connecticut's law. So he says that maybe Connecticut someday will have in its constitution something like the federal constitution, an establishment clause that puts up a wall between the separation of church and state.
But it's not in the Constitution?
No.
No.
No. And it was Jefferson's private opinion,
That's
and
right.
a personal letter,
That's right.
et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of constitutional scholars treat it as if it's like, like we treat Paul's letter to the Galatians. It's like, it's like, Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists, as if it has some sort of canonical authority. I've raised this in the book Politics for Christians. I said, imagine if a pro-lifer were to cite Ronald Reagan's Human Life Review article as as an authority of why Roe v. Wade should be overturned. I mean, people would think that's outrageous. It's just sort of a mystery to me why Jefferson carries. Right. I mean, obviously he was a founder, but still it shouldn't.
But
the other clause in the First Amendment, the free exercise thereof, that it seems to me is a Catholic invention, and it's borne out by by the history of that period
Yes.
you've been describing. I mean, in Connecticut, you have a congregational church,
Yes.
which is established. In Massachusetts, you've got these Puritans,
That's
these
right, yeah.
Presbyterians. In Virginia, you have the Episcopal Church.
Yeah.
But in Maryland, you have a free exercise
Yes.
of religion. I mean, that's the refuge, the safe haven for Catholics who were forced to flee places like Boston. They settle in Maryland because they respect the rights of people to pursue their own faith
That's right.
without interference from the government.
So there's a false notion of the
Yeah.
separation of church and state. Is there a good notion?
I think in some ways, part of what Jefferson is saying, I think, is correct. That is, if you're talking about the institutional church having sort of a separate sovereignty or authority from the government, that's something that no matter where one stands, let's say on certain public policy issues, everyone sort of can agree on. But what's happened over the past generation or so, the separation of church and state, as sort of a separation between the institutional church and the institutional state, has morphed into the separation of religion from politics.
Right.
And so
right.
what's happened is the separation of church and state has become a metaphor for the divorce of faith and reason.
And for a good reason, too,
Yeah.
because there's no way you can have a transcendent standard or authority for morality apart from religion. And so if you want to relativize morality and make it subject to a majoritarian impulse, then the quickest and surest way to do it is to privatize religion and to utilize separation of church and state to kind of shoehorn that into place.
Yeah, we have many people today talking about not the freedom of religion anymore, but a freedom of worship, where you're only
Private
inside the
assembly,
four walls of the church and having no influence in the rest of
And
life.
freedom from religion, which a lot of these secularists would like to see enshrined in the Constitution, so that religion is silenced, so marginalized that the damn thing disappears, and they're not bothered anymore by these God people.
Yeah.
Now, I want to suggest something,
Sure.
though, that to distinguish between church and state and between religion and politics is really right.
Yeah.
Your subtitle is Statecraft as Soulcraft, drawing from Aristotle.
Yes.
Who understands the difference between soul and body. I mean, these are two different substances, and yet, in fact, they are united by a person and also in society. And not only are they united, but the soul is the form of the body. And so the soul ought to be allowed to inform and transform the body. And already by the 2nd century, long before Constantine had Christianized the empire, we have this anonymous Christian writing a letter describing how the church is scattered throughout the empire. Not like the Jews who were only in Jerusalem and Judea, who had their own customs, but now in the New Covenant, they wear the same things, they do the same things, etc., except when it comes to morality. And so the description of the church as the soul of the body, something that Jacques Maritain picked up on and others, it seems to me to allow for distinguishing between church and state, distinguishing between religion and politics, like we did in the Middle Ages, sacerdotium and imperium. The clergy on the one hand and the political powers on the other. And yet a friend of mine did his doctorate on the medieval period of the 13th century, showing that you'll never find one instance of church-state language.
Yes.
Because the imperium, that is the political authorities, though they were lay people, they were baptized. They were confirmed. They were married in the church. They didn't think of themselves, well, they're the church because they're the clergy, we're the state because we're laity. It was a social organism.
That's right.
It was a sacramental
Well,
organism.
the medium in which
Yeah.
men lived and moved was the church, the faith, Christendom.
I mean, church.
You might as well ask a fish, what is it like? What is it like to encounter water? There's a wonderful
The church
unself-consciousness
was the civil society.
about that. Right.
Yeah.
And obviously the ecclesiastical leaders were different than the leaders of the government in terms of their authority. Yeah. People distinguished the papacy from the king, right? But you're right, but the king was a baptized Christian.
Right. I think sometimes our enemies understand the inner logic of our belief system better than we do, because it's not as though Jesus Christ is the King of Kings. Oh, wait, he is. No, it's not as though he said, go make disciples of all nations. Oh, wait, he did that too. It's not just private individuals who are privately converting. There's something that is meant to be bringing about a social transformation. And if we're not volunteering for it, others are like, well, it's only a matter of time before their kids or grandkids are going to wake up and try to do again what their ancestors did before.
I mean, the principle, I think, which we apply equally in something like the theology of God as we do in the theology of man is you distinguish only in order to unite.
Yeah.
You don't sunder the two. Faith and life go together. I mean, if you remove faith from life, then you leave man incomplete. I mean, he lives on this stage, and there ought to be provision for God, but if he can't access that dimension, then you have done violence to man.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he ought to rise up in revolt.
Well, I think that's what's precisely going on right now in our public culture, this attempt to, I think you mentioned earlier, the whole idea of freedom to worship.
Right.
I mean, worshiping is obviously part of one's religious life and devotion, but it's not the entirety of it.
That's right.
And this was something I had mentioned at one of my talks at Franciscan. To the audience, we talked about I spoke about the HHS mandate, and one of the points that I stressed to the audience, tried to explain to them why secularists think the way they do about, for example, the Catholic view of contraception or even abortion, is that in their minds, the HHS mandate is connected to medicine. Medicine is connected to science. Science is grounded in reason. Your view is faith.
Right.
And so there's, in their minds, a kind of conflict between faith and reason.
That's right.
And I think the right way to think about it is that it's really not a conflict between faith and reason. It's a conflict between two different understandings of reason.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so,
Exactly.
so the question is, what is the proper function? What is the correct ordering of our sexual powers? Is there an end or good to which they're ordered? The secular says no. I look at nature and I just see a bunch of stuff.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
right.
And whatever end or purpose of my sexual powers is the consequence of my will. You know, I sort of impose on nature my will, whereas the traditional, not only Catholic, but Christian and actually noble pagan view is that nature itself has intrinsic purposes to it and we discover it. But the way in which the secularist presents it as this kind of, instead of looking at it as two answers to the same question, they want to turn it into two different subjects.
This is so huge because it isn't just contraception, abortion, and the definition of marriage. I mean, you go back a century or two, and this impulse that defined reason over and against faith still affirmed the soul. Mm-hmm. You know, it still affirmed morality, but there was a shrinkage that was taking place that we have reached an endpoint for. And I can't help but think that people now are saying that the way we understand reason, it doesn't lead to the notion of a soul. It doesn't lead to the notion of a person. It's been mechanized. It's materialistic. We are bodies, biochemical functions. And if you're trying to appeal to anything beyond that, that's faith. You got to scratch your head and say, that was never faith.
That's right.
I mean, for Plato and for Aristotle and classical antiquity, this was reason, a robust reason, and as Pope Emeritus Benedict points out, it is reason's dynamic openness to reality, not this self-enclosed, where if you can't prove that by my own canons of reason, then it doesn't exist.
This is what Giussani calls the religious sense, which is to ask the question, what is the meaning of everything? A totalizing approach to reality. And if you don't make room for that, you're being irrational.
Right.
You're shrinking the reach and proportion of reason. And that's a stolen base. That diminishes man.
That's right. I think that one of the reasons why we're at this place is that you have this kind of, kind of a bait and switch. That is, you have the claim on the part of the secularists, we're going to have a neutral public square. Everyone can sort of believe what they want about ultimate things. But it turns out, though, the rules of the game are set in such a way that only one set of opinions wind up being reflected in the public life. And of course, they happen to be consistent with the sort of the materialist, secular view of reality. And it's done precisely because the rules are written in a way in which certain types of claims are ruled out of bounds and irrational from the outset. It's basically, taking over more and more of intellectual real estate, so to speak, that in the past was considered to be perfectly legitimate to inhabit by religious believers.
But I think you're right that it is growing, and I think it's intrinsically ordered to become all-encompassing.
Right.
That it isn't like, well, we would like 80% of your worldview.
Right.
You know,
Right, yeah.
we would like 80% of your rhetoric in the public square. We want to dominate and control in an exclusive way what you can say and how you can reason when it comes to public morality. And public morality isn't even a comfortable term anymore.
Right. And they believe in, they use the
Values.
terms such as tolerance, but they have no tolerance for those who disagree with them. They don't, as the secularists, they don't want us to, let bygones be bygones. They really do want us to succumb with the HHS mandate and so many other ways.
Yeah, you
where they're
can't have it both
forcing.
ways. I think of Marx's definition of man, matter in motion. If he's right, then when you cease to have motion, you're dead. You're just matter. If that's true, then by George, let's legislate that. But if Aristotle and Thomas are right, that the soul is the animating force and principle of the body, what the French call élan vital, then if that's true, then by George, we need to legislate that instead. It's one or the other.
Yes.
We are a religious people. And our institutions, at least the Supreme Court told us this a couple generations ago, they presuppose a belief in God.
That's right. And that's the basis from which, our nation grants our rights. It's not from our government, but from God himself.
That's what the founders believed.
Yeah. So stay with us on Franciscan University Presents.
Plato, way back in ancient Greece, made the observation that the order of the soul is reflected in the order of the commonwealth. It's picked up by, of course, Aristotle, Cicero, and so forth, other great thinkers throughout history. In other words, if more people are rightly formed, if their souls are rightly formed, the greater the possibility that the political order, that the community is going to be rightly formed, the politics, the social life is going to be the way it should be, the way a healthy political order is supposed to be. I think our great problem right now is that we have such poor formation on the part of so many people. So the important thing is to have the right principles. And I think with youth you see this particularly, by the way, that a lot of youth are just swept along by, I think, prevailing thinking, which reaches them in a whole bunch of sort of unfortunate ways, whether it be mass media, whether it be peers, whether it be Hollywood, a whole range of things which are themselves no great paragons of morality or virtue or common sense even.
Explore the treasures of your Catholic heritage on a Franciscan University pilgrimage. Led by inspiring spiritual directors, you'll walk in the footsteps of saints and martyrs in the Holy Land, Poland, France, and Italy, and you'll deepen your love for Jesus Christ through daily Mass, confession, prayer, and the joy of Christian fellowship. Let Franciscan University lead you on a pilgrimage of faith. Find out more at franciscan.edu/pilgrimages.
Welcome back to Franciscan University Presents. This entire program springs forth from the very heart of Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio. Our taping today is happening right here in our Communication Arts Studios. All the camera and the equipment are being operated by our students. Our panelists, our theology professors here at the university. And today we've been talking with Dr. Francis Beckwith. The book, Politics for Christians, a great book and a really wonderful conversation today about politics, how it's much broader. We talked a little bit about, in last segment, about the separation of church and state and the real interaction between them. So now looking forward at Christians in the public square, is there a right place where we have to either check our faith at the door, or do Christians really need to be more engaged in the public life?
I think they have to be more engaged for a variety of reasons. One, if for no other reason than to be concerned about the rights of the church. That is, and what I mean by the church is just not the institutional church, but believers and their right to exercise their faith in either their business enterprises or their private life or their public life. What you see today, unfortunately, is an understanding of religion and religious liberty which limits it to sort of the private self.
We're being shut out.
That's right. So for instance, you have cases just recently of people in professional life, such as photographers, bakers, florists, and these are all professions, by the way, that engage in activities that are almost artistic forms of expression, right? So you had a case in New Mexico recently where Elaine Photography, run by a couple of evangelical Christians, they were asked by a prospective client to take photographs at a same-sex ceremony.
Right.
They don't have same-sex marriage is not legal in New Mexico, but they were asked, and the woman Elaine wrote actually a very nice note and said, "I really can't do it. I'm not. As a Christian, for me to cooperate with my talents and gifts
right.
in something that I consider to be unethical violates my conscience."
Right. Right.
She was immediately. Soon after that, the couple filed a grievance with the Human Rights Commission of New Mexico, and she was fined, I think, around $9,000. Right. And then eventually she lost, after going up the ladder in the court system, she lost in the Supreme Court of New Mexico. And in one of the concurring opinions, the judge told Elaine Photography, that is the price you have to pay.
Yeah.
To have a business.
And this is not going to go away.
No, it's going to get
3
worse.
to 5 years.
It's getting worse.
I think we have to trace this trajectory boldly and cautiously, and recognize that it is going to get worse.
Yeah.
And for the time being, I think our own role in politics is going to be personal influence, friendship, where Providence puts us in positions where we can slow it down, as a friend of mine puts it, so that we can learn how to lose more slowly.
Well, I have a little bit more optimistic view.
Yeah, but I mean, at this point, we're not. I mean, it isn't like in 5 years we're going to elect a president and say, "Hey, look, it was nice while it lasted, but let's get back to traditional morality and let's enforce that."
Yeah.
Our kids and our grandkids are going to face a different situation that is going to change drastically.
That's right. I mean, you find, and what's interesting about this transformation is that years ago, probably in the 80s, there were a number of political philosophers who wrote about what they call it's a kind of term of art in philosophy called political liberalism. And their chief argument was that on matters over which reasonable citizens disagree, the state should sort of restrain itself and not be coercive. So according to the kind of the liberalism that was dominant in the 80s and 90s, the idea that the state could coerce somebody on a matter concerning sexual morality, which, in a sense people have different views on, would in fact be quite offensive. I mean,
much less wedding photography.
That's right. So what's happened though is that we've shifted from a kind of political liberalism to a new type of confessional state.
A totalitarian
and
indoctrinating.
So before, there was a sense in which Christians and non-Christians could sort of live together, understand there's going to be a kind of play in the joints in some places, and that we may disagree, but we understand we're all sort of reasonable. But now what's happened is that I kind of think that was a sort of in-between time that really couldn't last anyways.
It's a strategic. It's a strategic.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is a kind of.
I've talked to Christians who lived in Malaysia, Indonesia, and elsewhere, where they got along great with Muslims. Until suddenly there was a majority.
Yeah.
And what we're facing is a kind of secularistic Sharia.
Yeah.
Which is imposing itself gradually because now they can, and they're going to do as much as they can.
So how do we deal with this?
Well,
how can
you resist. I think there's a kind of implicit counsel of despair in that description you gave us from your friend.
I didn't finish.
But it seems to me if you use this as a metaphor for faith, it's a house. What the secular order is telling us is, look, you guys go live in the garage or the cellar or the vestibule. We're relegating you to all of those distant rooms. But how can you do that to God? I mean, Dante says God is he whose center is everywhere, his circumference nowhere. How do you squeeze him out? How do you marginalize God? We want him in every room. The bedroom, the parlor, the kitchen, not just the vestibule, not just on Sundays.
Right.
That's right. I think one reason why I don't think there's a vast majority of secularists. I think what's happened is that the realization is that at every point Christians are willing to acquiesce in order to avoid pain. Yeah. And so what happens is you'll find some Christians, okay, I think, for example, same-sex relations are wrong, but, if I sort of come out against or to support, let's say, Elaine photography, I know I'll get really nasty emails, people will blog about me negatively, it may actually ruin my job prospects, I can't put that on my CV. I mean, so there's what's going on, a kind of bullying. And so even though I don't think that there's I think there's a greater number of seculars, to be sure, but it's not the vast numbers.
Well, it's not the quantity, it's the quality. It's
Yes.
the fact that they are in higher education. It's that they're in
right.
federal government politics.
That's right.
And other strategic places
but
such
I mean,
as the
this
media.
practice.
But let me
I'm
say
sorry.
something, because
Yeah.
in 20 plus years of doing this show, I have never been accused by Regis of being a counsel of despair. On the other hand, what I would say, we have biblical examples of like Joseph in Egypt under Pharaoh. What are the chances of Joseph ending up a righteous man? And yet he was able to do not only a lot of good for Pharaoh by becoming a prime minister and feeding him and Egypt and many other nations. We also have Daniel in Babylon, of all places, carried off. And then suddenly, because of the graces that he has personally, he's able to bring about a kind of conversion that Nebuchadnezzar confesses that the God of Daniel is the God of gods. And I think we also have a man like Obadiah, who is a prophet in the court of King Ahab when Queen Jezebel is corrupting things. And he's like leaven in bread that is getting harder, but at the same time, he's protecting the prophets in 1 Kings 18, hiding them because he knows things are about to turn. And when Elijah, that famous chapter where the prophets of Baal are defeated by Elijah, I mean, the prelude to that is precisely the meeting of Obadiah, who is an anointed prophet in the court of this pagan king, and Elijah, who's hiding in a cave. We have a book of Obadiah. We don't have a book of Elijah. You have written a book because you are encouraging people to become Josephs and Daniels and Obadiahs. I admit, I'm more of an Elijah. But I mean, let's face it, there does come a time where Christians have to recognize that we've got to come out of Jerusalem before 70 AD. We've got to come out of Sodom and Gomorrah when the angels come. We've got to come out of Egypt. We've got to come out of Babylon and go back someplace. We're not there. But to say that, no, that stopped in history. We never have to become pilgrims for our family's sake. That, I think, is a counsel of despair.
And also, I think when you look at even a more modern example of when Pope John Paul II went to Poland, I really think that's an inspiring message for us today. When those 9 days that he came, when the Poles came together and they realized as they celebrated Mass, as they looked around and they saw, here are all the Polish people, all the Catholics together, and here are just a handful of communists. They may have power, but there are many of us.
9 days that changed the world.
Yeah, it changed the world, and I think we can do that in America.
This ethic, which I think has spread abroad and taken hold, give in to get along. I think you can extract from that a principle that would legitimize the good German getting along with the Gestapo when they come down to get the Jew who lives next door. I'll say nothing because I don't want to disturb the peace. I've got kids, I've got a job, I've got to protect my assets.
That's right.
Where do you draw the line? I mean, Edmund Burke says the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And that's a kind of recipe for nothing.
That's right. Years ago, and Scott remembers Francis Schaeffer.
Oh, yeah.
The great Presbyterian writer who had an influence on my becoming a philosopher. He in a book he wrote called A Christian Manifesto, which is looking back now as a Catholic, there are parts of it that I part ways with.
But there's a lot of good insights.
But there's a lot of good insights, and one of the insights he says is that the principles that he sees that are coming to the forefront in American culture will lead to a time where people will abandon their liberty for peace and prosperity. And I loathe to confess this, but I do think that we may be at the edge of that time. And I see this on the part of friends of mine who are widely known evangelical pastors who are very, very nervous and who I'm not sure when the dam breaks they're going to be willing to, or where they're going to stand.
So looking at the odds that are kind of stacked against us, if you will, and all the situation in our culture and our world today, what are some of the things that we as Catholics can do to make a better case for our faith in the public square?
I think that we have to be better Catholics in our private lives. I mean, the reality is that in some ways the church has been hurt in terms of its reputation by the way in which Catholics, both clergy and lay people, have conducted their lives. And I think we have to show that the life of Christ can be lived authentically.
Yeah.
You know, that might seem
that's a
small,
witness.
but that's immense.
Think about the Roman Empire. I mean, people were persuaded not only by the arguments, but by the lives lived.
That's
And your colleague at Baylor, Rodney Stark, who started his career as a religious sociologist, somewhat of an agnostic, but in his book, The Rise of Christianity, shows how living out the Catholic or the Christian life is really transformative. You know, one of my favorite Peanuts strips was Linus and Lucy walking by that little bird Woodstock with his wings up. What's he doing? He heard the sky is falling. And he thinks he can hold up the entire sky with those two little legs. And they walk away laughing. And Woodstock thinks one does what one can.
Yes, that's it. That's
And I think what married couples do, I remember at Marquette in a doctoral seminar, it was a throwaway line. This professor, Father Keefe, who was not only a brilliant theologian, but a jurisprudentialist too, who taught at the law school, he interrupted himself and just, you know, we were discussing Newhouse's Naked Public Square, and he said, you know, if Catholic couples just simply lived out the power of the sacrament, the covenant of their marriage, that indissolubility, that love, in 40 years, our society would be Christianized without a politician.
Yeah.
You know, and I just thought, wow. You know, I wasn't even a Catholic yet, but I realized there is a profound and penetrating insight there. That if we live out the grace that we celebrate, it's going to transform our society.
That's right, and also the way in which part of that is when we live out our lives authentically as Christians. When we present our arguments, because arguments do have to play a role, we should do it with a sense of humor and a winsomeness, and not, you know, seem kind of uptight. I mean, that's part of it is to have, you know, to show a kind of joy. And it's sometimes difficult.
It's infectious, though.
I mean, you know, it's difficult sometimes.
But joy is what everyone's looking for.
That's right.
Not just pleasure. You know, joy is irresistible and irrefutable, especially when you're just bearing witness to your own experience.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, if in advancing your thesis you betray a kind of neurosis and you cling in an unhealthy way to your faith, then people are entitled to ask, what the hell is the matter with Catholic Christianity? It invites psychosis. You need to exude a kind of joy and an affirmation about the goodness of what you're doing and make it infectious so that others are somehow captured, charmed.
Perfect. Stay with us on Franciscan University Presents.
Here at Franciscan, I'm in a program called the Center for Leadership, which is concerned with creating good, moral Catholic leaders in the laity, people who aren't going to be priests and nuns or follow a religious life, because we have to do just as much work as they will in perfecting the culture. So, for example, I want to be a political analyst. So after completing this program, I'd be able to go out and use what I've learned through reason and through faith to try and change things and shine a light on issues in our government and social world today.
My name is Joseph Grelich. I'm a chemistry major, biology minor here at Franciscan University. I love the atmosphere, just completely centered around the Catholic faith. When I play soccer, when I'm in classes, everything has that same Catholic attitude. Myself and a few other chemistry majors had the opportunity to work with top scientists in order to combat neglected diseases. I was able to connect my love for chemistry and also my love for mission work by synthesizing chemical compounds. Franciscan University is academically excellent and passionately Catholic.
Welcome back to Franciscan University Presents. Today we've been talking about politics and Christians with our special guest, Dr. Francis Beckwith. We've come to our final segment, so Regis, could you kick us off?
I like that word, kick us off, because there is an idea that has been sort of kicking around here, but it's largely remained dormant. And I think it needs to be part of an argument that we advance in this public conversation that we'd like to have with the secularists. And that is to tell them over and over and ingeniously and aggressively and without apology that to be an atheist is really to be sort of subhuman. It's an aberration. It's a kind of sickness. Man is a religious being. And this is not an insight peculiar to the Gospels. This antedates Christianity. Good pagans recognize this. I mean, this is what Tacitus said, who wrote the Annals of the Roman Empire, and asks himself the question, what constitutes the city? And he said, it's not the emperor, it's not wise laws, a just constitution, it's not the army, it's the temples of the gods. And we don't have temples of the gods. We have TV, we have internet.
Yes.
We need to have people see the cathedral spires and to be drawn to that beacon of hope, because there's nothing else. And if the state, society won't make provision for religion, then it is an inhuman society. I mean, man needs to be able to develop himself, not just materially, not just fraternally, but in terms of adoration, worship of God. The state has to make provision for that. Wow. I'm sort of arguing for a kind of confessional society. It's not going to happen anytime soon. We need to seed an authentically Christian culture first, but this is a beginning.
Thank you. Scott.
I like what you just said. I mean, we're not going to succeed, so why compromise? Why not go down uncompromised, you know? And then watch our Lord raise us up. You know, the fact that religion and morality are weird to a whole new generation. The weirdification of traditional religion and morality is the most ultimately weird thing of all, and yet it's the air we're breathing, the water we're drinking, but it's not going to be forever because God is real and true. And I think what you just said earlier about living the Catholic life, you know, and doing it with a generosity and a joy, it's the key. You know, I think of Father Bernie, this Pittsburgh priest who came back from Rome and came to a Polish parish, and, you know, his first, you know, his Advent in this, he looks down the aisles and there are like 90 Christmas trees. It's like, what's going on? And this Polish lady says, we have 100, but we only have 90. And he said, woman, it's enough to have these, you know. And she turned around, muttered something, and walked out. And he knew she'd cursed him. Yeah. He said to the custodian, she cursed me. No, no. Father, what she said was, with God, always more, never less. Yeah. And now, Father Bernie's Archbishop Hebda in new work, I heard this when he was giving a retreat in Rome. And I just think that with God, always more, never less. Generosity and joy. He won't be outdone in generosity. And I also think of what you were saying about the 9 days that changed the world. Our Lady of Czestochowa has, like a mother, revived the soul of the Polish Catholic peoples. It's got a long way to go. It's got a lot of crises. But I just came back from Our Lady of Guadalupe. And there you see, you know, it was the new Spain, and then when they cast off Spain, they were going to cast off the faith, except that she had united herself as a mestizo, you know, to the Indians, converting 9 or 10 million, and suddenly the faith was not reducible to Spanish politics. And so the people, though they have corrupt Masonic rulers, you know, for centuries or whatever, that faith is so strong. And I also think of what Our Lady of America has done, although most Catholics don't know about her. I also think of Our Lady of Fatima. Russia will be converted. Stay tuned. The end of the story has not come. There's a lot of cause for hope and joy and generosity.
That's great. That's great.
You know, anytime, we're all situated in history at some point in history, and so we tend to think, you know, the end is near. That's because it seems near to us, right? But think about Augustine, right? Seeing the barbarians, you know, breaking down the gates and think it's over, right? Well, a lot of things happened since him, right? You had a restoration of culture. You've had a decline and restoration. I think we have to have, first off, confidence. Confidence that the changes that we want or the changes we desire, the conversion of people may not be in our lifetime.
Right.
On the other hand, we still have to make the public argument and the public witness. And several years ago, I was giving a talk at Texas Tech University, and it was at the law school. And I was talking about these issues in politics and religion. And one of the professors that was in the audience stood up during the question and answer period, and he said, Professor Beckwith, all you've given us are religious arguments. And I looked at him and I said, wow, I'm relieved. I thought you were going to say they were bad arguments. Now, and it was a moment of a kind of intellectual epiphany. It occurred to me at that moment that what this gentleman was doing was, by putting the adjective religious in front of my point of view, it sort of intellectually sequestered it as sort of beyond and outside the public discourse. And it was at that point that I began, this was about 10 years ago, I began writing and thinking more about the problem of being able to communicate our views as reasonable and rational. So in the current debate over the HHS mandate, there's a sense in which our fellow citizens who don't think the Catholic view is correct think of our view as similar to our view of transubstantiation. They don't see it as something that can be reasonably defended or presented. And I think that's partly our fault. Right. We tend to just appeal to religious liberty, which is, I think, perfectly correct and appropriate. But we also have to make the argument outside the court that this is a reasonable view to hold. It's one that it has an ancient roots. The smartest people in history have believed it. These arguments are good. You may not accept them, but that's fine. And believe it or not, I think that in some ways may sway people not to obviously embrace our view, but to say, I understand why Catholics hold it, we should respect them and allow them to conduct their business consistent with their worldview.
Right.
Mm-hmm. That is great. Well, thank you for being on the program, for joining us here at Franciscan University. If you've enjoyed today's program, we have a free handout for you, Government Forms or Deforms The Soul by Francis Beckwith. It's available for download at faithandreason.com, or just for asking for it, we'll send this off to you. We're talking about politics, and I think it would be no surprise that we see this from a very different vantage point as Catholics. And I think the first thing we need to realize is that this is a spiritual battle, and that there is only one way to begin this and to completely end this is on our knees in prayer, because our nation, founded on these godly principles, needs to return to it, and only return to it with the providence of Almighty God. So we need to pray, but I also think we need to change the way we think. Much like we talked about the 9 days that changed the world, I think we need to realize that we are still the sovereigns of our country, that we, the people, are the ones that really need to take the action and step forward. And 3, I just think we need to do something. Whether it's actually getting involved in some committee in your parish or your community, running for office, whatever it might be. And also, politics is downstream from culture. There are many ways to influence and affect politics. So just do something. Franciscan University's mission is to form the students who are going to be transforming the world. And I want to invite you to be a part of our mission here at the university. Maybe that's coming to take classes and get your degree at Franciscan University, or online or through our distance education. Maybe it's joining us for one of our vibrant, dynamic summer conferences, or joining us on a pilgrimage to holy shrines around the world. Whatever it might be, I want to invite you to be a part of this, to come to faithandreason.com. We have some of the folks here on our programs giving you great insights, great tools to live the evangelization that the popes have been calling for. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you.
To download the free handout on today's topic, go to faithandreason.com. Email your request for the handout to presents@franciscan.edu. At faithandreason.com, you can also purchase past episodes of Franciscan University Presents, or request today's free handout and purchase past programs by calling 888-333-0381. That's 888-333-0381, or call 740-283-6357.